So this is part of a series that we have been doing all year to talk about what's happening in Washington. I am Liz Powell, the founder and head of G2G Consulting. I'm joined by Chris Campbell and Chris Oates. And I think it's probably helpful to start off and do some introductions. So you heard mine. So Chris Campbell, do you want to give yours?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Chris Campbell, I'm now Chief Strategist at a risk advisory firm called Kroll. But before that was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. And before that was the Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee.
And I'm Chris Oates, political risk analyst, working my own company called Two Lanterns, and which does workshops. Before that, I was at a company called Oxford Analytica, which was not Cambridge Analytica, which was a big hassle that we always had to say every time we introduced ourselves.
Great. Okay. And so, as I said, I'm the head of G2G Consulting. Before that, I worked on the Hill as a legislative director for a couple of different members of Congress. And all of us work with a lot of businesses, organizations, helping them navigate what the heck is going on in government, what they should be doing to maximize their engagement, sort of manage risk, all those types of things. So we like to get together a few times throughout the year and talk about what is going on. So I like to play the role of more of a facilitator moderator here with our two experts. So first question, how would you sum up the key issues that are going on today? And why don't we start with Chris Campbell?
Yeah, well, geez, there's certainly a lot of them. As we know, we're quickly approaching the November elections, which looks like the ground is shifting a bit politically. The dynamic, the Democrats were able to pass ultimately a slimmed down version of what was Build Back Better, which now was named to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a large win for many of the progressives and Democrats' priorities that have been around for a long time. It looks like the economy, some indicators of the economy are beginning to improve, most notably the jobs reports. However, economists from both sides of the aisle suggest that there are some turbulent times ahead, as we are projecting as well. And so there's and then of course you can't fail to mention the document seizure with here in Florida from the former president, which is certainly changing issues, and then also the dynamic of abortion going into the November elections. And so lots going on politically. There's probably not much more that's going to happen legislatively between now and November. But kind of the ground has been laid effectively for the November elections, and now it's kind of a bare knuckle brawl between now and then to see which party ultimately is successful in the congressional elections coming up.
Yeah, that's great. Chris Oates, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm going to toot away, because I remember last time we were here, I said I do think that a stripped down Build Back Better would pass, and I did think that Roe v. Wade would change the dynamics. And I think what's really interesting is not that I was right, because a lot of people predicted that, but was that both things happened, or Build Back Better basically came back from the dead. Because I thought that 3 months ago. It's like, oh, over the course of the summer, it's very likely that something's going to happen. And then it was completely dead. Very few Democrats thought they had any chance. And you could see this in the statements being made against Joe Manchin from other senators. It was very clear they thought, this is completely done, and I can unload all of the pent up anger I've ever had. And then all of a sudden, a week and a half later, he announced that he and Chuck Schumer had basically struck a deal while everyone else was busy dealing with the CHIPS Act. And so what I think it shows, and the reason I bring this up, is because things can change very quickly in politics, even if they're not going to shift from Democrats are absolutely going to lose the House to Democrats are absolutely going to win. You can see shifts from 80% to 60% of losing the House relatively quickly. So what I'm looking forward to to see in the next couple of months is, what are the things right now that are going to keep shifting, and what are the things that are going to recede? So for example, we've seen that obviously in the generic ballot, Democrats have picked up a few points since the Dobbs Act, the Dobbs decision, but actually in some of the underlying numbers, it seems like that might be even more. New registrations are wildly more women than men, which is something that doesn't really fit well into polling models, because we're used to the demographics of the electorate being roughly the same as they were in past years. So if those underlying demographics of who's registering voting are different, it could be that the generic ballot is actually underestimating Democrats. It also could be that it's overestimating Democrats in the same way that it was in 2020. And then the other one, as Chris mentioned, is this issue of the documents at Mar-a-Lago. We just saw last night, apparently there was documents related to the nuclear program of a foreign country, which I'm highly certain is one on the Mediterranean coast in between Egypt and Lebanon, but who knows? That's the sort of thing that could be the kind of story that just keeps on coming, because what our media loves is the story that has just enough speculation that we can talk about it on cable news and say, what do you think is going to come next? And also that has enough new things happening, because it's not a good news story if it just comes out in one massive, report that just happens and then sinks away in a few news cycles. We saw that with the Mueller report. It was an enormous report and it was forgotten about relatively quickly. What is much better from a news perspective is something that drips out with one detail every few days to just keep it in the press. So will this story be that thing that just keeps it in the news, specifically keeps Donald Trump in the news for the next 9 weeks, driving up Democratic turnout in a way that doesn't usually happen during a midterm election? So that's what I'm going to see. And I think, as Chris mentioned as well, these are not necessarily legislative things. And that's one thing that I think is important to note, is that Congress is, I don't want to say they're done for the year, because there's definitely more things on their docket, but I think one of the most surprising things since we spoke a few months ago was just how much of Joe Biden's agenda did get passed over the course of the summer, when it looked like in June it might be dead for good with Manchin's opposition. So that is, I think, something is just a lot of legislating happened while folks were maybe at the beaches, hopefully at the beaches. I hope you had a good summer.
Yeah, I remember this well, your prediction. And I think that both Chris and I were like, I don't know. So you definitely get the, I told you so on that one. Some other interesting things happening are SBI reauthorization. And my good friend Becky put a little note in there. That's a big one that will expire September 30th. A lot of other things actually will too. There's some flood assistance programs. There's several programs that actually will expire because we hit the end of the fiscal year. So before October 1, they got to do some kind of stopgap measure. And they clearly are nowhere near an agreement on all their 12 appropriation bills. So they'll do some kind of stopgap that will hold over through the elections. And then I think that what happens on election day will determine whether or not they can come back in December, work together and come up with some kind of final omnibus, or there's such a huge swing as a result of the elections. It's so partisan that they just push it off to January, with the new Congress controlling, wrapping up a big omnibus while starting the next FY24 appropriations process. I do have faith that there will be some kind of omnibus at some point, because now we have earmarks and other little Christmas tree items that members want to make sure get done. So I do think we will get it done. It's just the timing of that is up in the air. The other interesting thing that's been going on is that with the CHIPS Act, $50 billion worth of money. The White House is unveiling their Chips for America $28 billion program. There's just so much happening with that. And since we have a lot of folks in Ohio, we at G2G, we're based both in Cleveland, Columbus, as well as in DC. So we've got a lot of activity, and we're doing our own special event actually on September 23rd, all about what this new Intel manufacturing facility in Ohio will do for the state and the country. So I think there's a lot more that's going to come out of that one as well. That's exciting for innovators out there, not just manufacturing side, but I think innovation side as well. There's COVID spending. There's been a pullback from the White House saying they don't have any more money. So with them not covering shots and tests, I think that's going to have an impact. And then another item is the Ukraine aid, the disaster aid. Those are all factors that will come into the stopgap measure as well, and funding overall. So Just a lot sort of in the air. But I don't think that actual activity and real action will happen until after the elections, as Chris was saying, just because there's not much time. They're not even in session in October. So they're literally only here for a few weeks. So given all that sort of overview of some key things happening, things that we're watching, what do you think are key factors that will shape what Congress and the White House can do now through the end of the year? Obviously the elections are a big one, but anything with the economy, with inflation, other things going on that you think are going to be big factors? And then we definitely will delve into the elections as well, but overall thoughts, Chris Campbell?
Yeah, look, I do mostly the economy and Federal Reserve and that kind of policy, but so like I think the Federal Reserve indicated about a week ago that they're going to continue to increase interest rates, which is likely going to put us into a recession. So that's likely we're going to see in the next three quarters. And so that's going to be a real challenge, I think, for most companies trying to raise money and the average American. We're starting to see defaults now in what we call junk loans, or very high risk loans. We're starting to see an uptick in defaults, which is an indicator that we're going to start seeing a higher than normal defaults in consumer credit, as well then as housing as well. And so we're likely, we're coming upon a really significant, what could be a really significant challenging time in the economy. Consumer confidence is at an all-time low right now. And so if the consumer stops spending, which of course what the Federal Reserve is trying to do is raising interest rates, is trying to slow consumer spending. It looks like it's starting to work, but we're still seeing the average American spending about $300 a month, mostly on credit, and so that credit is becoming more and more expensive every day. So all of those things lead to significantly turbulent times in the economy, which will work itself out over the course of the next year, or perhaps two. Then we'll bounce back in the next cycle. So that's kind of what we're looking forward ahead. So the backdrop of the economy right now is that many people would argue that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which actually spends more money, I think I would say the Democrats perhaps conflated the thrust of that bill, which I think perhaps you could argue that there's deficit reduction there, but certainly not inflation reduction. I think will probably accelerate the pace of inflation, and so it will likely negate what the Federal Reserve is trying to do, and so Federal Reserve is probably likely going to have to increase rates higher and at a higher clip now, which will hurt most average Americans over the course of the next 3 quarters significantly. So we'll start seeing lots of bankruptcies in the average families. So those are the kind of the things we're seeing now. The backdrop between now and November, most Americans won't see those that or feel that pain perhaps until after the elections or into next year. So that's kind of the backdrop of the economy. We're starting to see some funds starting to loosen some of their money and start investing. However, there's a great deal of uncertainty still. Which is, it's kind of a mixed bag that way. And so that's kind of the backdrop of the economy. I try not to get overly political as much as I can, but those are the major challenges that we're starting to see. The good thing is the Inflation Reduction Act is that there's an enormous amount of now new money that's being spent. Of course, both good and bad will cause inflation, but also will make a lot of people in the green energy sector quite wealthy. So there's a lot of money now being put out to companies in green energy projects, as well as put on top of that the infrastructure package that was passed earlier this year. So we have a great amount of money now that's being spent by the U.S. government to fund these infrastructure projects that will, I think, be quite a significant windfall for a lot of government contractors. And perhaps new starts of green energy projects, as well as some traditional energy that was quite favored by Joe Manchin. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag in the economy, because while the government is going to be spending money on these infrastructure projects, it's likely going to cause some significant pain on the left side of the bell curve for the average American family.
Yep. Yeah. Very, very helpful insights on the economy. I think that's huge. What do you think, Chris Oates? Oh, you're on mute.
Two things that I'm paying attention to, which are not actually in the US, but I think will affect us. One is the energy situation in Europe. Now, this is for a short term, it won't really affect the United States that much, because energy prices in Europe going up are not going to pass through that much to the United States. But long term, I think if you do see a real crisis in the energy market in Europe this winter, up to the end of the year, there's going to be a lot of pressure on European leaders to pull back from the war in Ukraine. You're already seeing that Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, is doing that. If that's true, that might command more of the US foreign policy establishment's attention, especially the president's attention, to try to keep Europe basically in the war, when Vladimir Putin just said today he's going to cut he's going to cut off oil deliveries to any European leaders that have this price cap. He's not going to have full gas deliveries as long as sanctions happen. In the long term, though, this is, I think, one of the best things that could happen to the United States, just thinking in a purely self-interested manner, because basically Europe now needs a new source of energy if it no longer wants to rely on Europe. So I think you're going to see, along with the climate and the infrastructure elements in the Inflation Reduction Act, more construction of LNG terminals, because the U.S. energy producers are now looking at Europe as one of their potentially biggest markets, even more than it is now. The other thing I'm paying attention to is how long COVID zero lasts in China, because that is actually, from an inflation point of view, kind of good for the United States, because it means that China is not having as much demand for commodities, which reduces demand globally. But it also does mean that if China starts to really weaken, it might bring down the global economy with it slightly. And what's happening this fall is that Premier Xi Jinping is going for a third term in office, which is likely to be basically from now until the end of his life, because they're also changing the rules. It may be the case that once that happens, he starts to act differently. He no longer has COVID zero as one of his strategies, or maybe now that he has basically assumed near total powers politically, then he starts to focus on economic growth, because he is now afraid that the population won't tolerate that without economic growth that COVID zero is kind of destroying. So those are two things outside the US. But if they do go, either if Xi Jinping starts to really crack down and do COVID zero, it might hurt the US economy, or it might command the president's attention. Same thing with what's going on in Europe.
Okay, fascinating. I love it. All over so many different things happening at once. So kind of shifting gears a bit. So what has been most surprising to you over the past few months in this realm of what's happening in Washington? And this time we'll go to Chris Oates.
I'd say, well, the single most surprising thing is Joe Manchin's reversal on Build Back Better to the Inflation Reduction Act. And I say that because no one seemed to see this coming, to the point where Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, basically accused Manchin of betrayal, saying that he had been promised there would be no Build Back Better, which is why McConnell voted for the CHIPS Act. And then I think just a couple hours later, they announced it. So that was probably the single biggest surprise, in terms of just went from we thought it was completely dead to all of a sudden it's here and it's about to pass. I think another one of the big surprises, although maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, is that elections are very easy when they're in the abstract and dealing with a generic ballot or abstract features. And then when candidates get nominated, things start to get a little complicated. So Mitch McConnell himself has said that it looks like he doesn't think Republicans will take back the Senate. And he claims it's due to candidate quality. Those are his words. So it's the sort of thing in January, you're looking forward, you're saying, well, here's the likely trajectory. But then once you start to nominate people like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, who's not running a very good campaign, Herschel Walker, and Georgia's not running a very good campaign. It looks like they might Republicans might nominate someone in New Hampshire who's very likely to lose that seat. Things get a little tricky. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to translate to the House as much, because their candidates are more generic. It's hard to know who sadly, not as many people know who their House member is. So I think that is the surprise, is the differential between the Senate and the House, from we assume they're both going to go together to actually they can diverge pretty wildly.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris Campbell, what are some surprising things that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think Chris is exactly right. I think that number one, actually, I think it's the political earthquake of the year probably was the very quiet deal that Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin were baking on what became the Inflation Reduction Act. There's no question. No one saw that coming. It's I've worked very closely with Senator McConnell when I was in the Senate. It's very hard. In fact, that's almost impossible to surprise him. I believe he was surprised. And so, I think it's, it's just that was an earthquake, no question. Look, I think Chris is right. I think that there was some question. Odds makers always like to do these horse race issues, but I think there was always a stretch for Republicans to win back the Senate. The conventional wisdom is there's going to be certainly a change in the House, so we're starting to see that now happen. And so as we march toward November, it's going to be interesting. Every day, I always remind people I've been through many cycles. I've worked in Congress, in literally every machination except for Republicans having 60 votes, and the Senate. And so I can tell you that every single day in politics is an absolute eternity. Something can happen tomorrow. You just never know. But there, as Oates said before, is accurate. There's a lot of external factors that are happening that are outside of U.S. control in this issue, and there's a lot of bad actors, both state and non-state actors, that certainly want to influence the elections upcoming in November. And so, it's going to be a wild ride between now and then. Every day is going to be a journey, and those of us who like to watch politics, I think we're going to be very happily glued to TV and print as we start seeing the races roll out and see how the issues lay themselves out between now and early November.
Yep, I agree with everything, and just want to add in the Dobbs, the Supreme Court decision. I think that on the one hand, it's to be expected. On the other hand, I think a lot of folks were shocked. And then just the sort of downstream effect of that, what's happening now in all the state legislatures, the stories that are bubbling up about what it means to have a complete ban, then different nuances of, exceptions. And so I just think that all of that is pouring into the elections. And as Chris Oates pointed out, many more women are now registering to vote than people expected. So who knows what that means for election day, but I think it's sort of been, on the one hand, predictable, on the other hand, surprising just how much that's weaving into what's going to happen on November 8th. So just another item. Getting into
Liz, if I can just jump in on Dobbs, because I think this is like a great example why I teach political forecasting at Boston University. And I'm always telling my students, remember that politics has a very small sample size, and conventional wisdom is often built on a particular set of circumstances that might not continue to apply. So the conventional wisdom with Dobbs was that, yes, it might fire up the Democratic base, but it could also fire the Republican base, because historically abortion was a big vote getter for conservative. And that's why Republicans were basically competing to be the most severe in many of these state legislatures. That only was able to be true because many Democrats didn't care. Many pro-choice people didn't care because they knew it was at the Supreme Court level. Didn't really matter what the state said. I mean, mattered to some extent, but ultimately it was always going to be the backstop of Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court. When that's removed, the calculation changes, and now all of a sudden these state legislative races actually have a real world impact rather than what they were for decades, which were largely symbolic signaling to one's base about where one stood. And that's the sort of thing that, I saw these analysts at the time be like, well, it's not going to be a big deal because here's what's happened over the past few decades. Like, yes, but those were decades in which Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. So it's why I think whenever you're watching the news at home and someone very confidently says, well, we all know the way it works, like that person probably doesn't know. So, I mean, obviously we three know, but, you know, I would just, it's one of those things why you need to, you know, follow political coverage with really a mountain of salt, and not take everything as the, you know, absolute gospel just because someone on cable news says it.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Theory versus reality. That's a huge factor.
Except
So-
for that person on cable news is me, they should literally
Absolutely.
I say.
Absolutely.
Of course. So getting into the elections, what do you all, I know you're all hinting your thoughts on the House versus Senate, but how close do you think it'll be in the House and in the Senate? And then 2 years from now with presidential predictions on that. So this time, let's start with Chris Campbell.
Of course, you have to go to me on this one. Look, I think the House is a foregone conclusion that it's going to flip. I don't know if it's going to be a gigantic wave, or it's still really early. Weirdly, it's actually early to tell this. There are some early indicators that Democrats have blunted the what I think was going to be a tidal wave going into November, largely driven, I think, by the Supreme Court case. There is, you know, again, there's going to be some hiccups between now and November 8th on the economy, which I think is always the largest driver of turnout and also votes. And so I think that, you know, I'm going to see how that plays out. But my prediction right now is the House flips, the Senate does not, and we have a divided government going into 2024. I think largely the House will take up an enormous amount of investigations in the Biden administration, probably, you know, initiate some form of impeachment proceedings against the president, and then which will lay the groundwork, I think, for 2024. The big X factor on the Republican side is going to be what the former president does. If there's an indictment, if there's not, I'm very, very, very concerned. I actually can't believe I'm going to say this in a recorded conversation, but I'm very, very concerned if there is an indictment, that there's likely going to be some significant political unrest throughout the country. I'm very, very concerned that it'll lead to loss of lives. And so I'm just really hopeful that there's some way that we can find a way to try to find a way to come together on this and really be very, very, very careful when trying to, you know, change or set precedent on these kinds of things. It's, you know, once a bell is rung in politics, it can literally never be unrung. I was in the Senate when Harry Reid changed the rules of the Senate on the what we call the nuclear, use the nuke. We call nuke the Senate, or change the rules of the Senate so that judges can be voted on by 50 votes and not 60. Republicans can, of course, then add it on that to change it to Supreme Court. And so once that happens, once you start that ball rolling, and you know, I think that, you know, I would say this way: I've been a lifelong Republican, and I'm probably the most bipartisan person you're ever going to meet. But I do know how Republican leaders and Republican members of Congress think. You know, I think it would be very, 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 very possible that if this Justice Department doesn't indict Hunter Biden, that we likely see an indictment of President Biden going into, if there was a Republican president in 2024, because of the Hunter relationship and with the current president. So I just think we have to be very careful how we do this as a country. We have the entire world respects us because we're not kind of crazy. We don't go after folks. But we have to be very careful, but also no one can be above the law. And so we have to be very, very careful and judicious about how we work on these issues. I think that likely, if there is an indictment, I think you're probably going to see the former president run. And you know, who knows what's going to happen? It's going to be a crazy time. I candidly don't think that the former president was going to run. I think that the Biden administration is probably going to force him to run. Maybe that's what they want. And so, okay, we'll see what happens. But I'm just very concerned about the level of political unrest, civil unrest we're going to see between now and 2024. Absent the former president running, I think there's going to be there'll be a wide open race on the Republican side. I certainly have my favorites. I'm not going to tell you who they are yet. And then the Democrats really is up to the current president If he does run, of course, he will be the nominee. Likely would be the nominee. If not, then I think that, there's going to be a wide open race on their Democratic side as well. Still very early. I always say that this time when Barack Obama was running or when Donald Trump was running, either even were thought of as even candidates. So we're still a long ways away from 2024. But the big X factor 2024, that just the kind of the big elephant in the room, if you will, is what the former president does and what the current Justice Department and Biden administration does with him legally.
Yeah. All right. Chris Oates, what do you think? First the House, the Senate, then the president.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Chris. I think the Senate is likely to stay Democratic. They're probably going to end up with 52 seats, just based on, when you do the projections for all the Senate seats, are likely to hold all of what they have now, and then pick up Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And then there's always the chance that they would lose one and then maybe pick up, North Carolina or something like that. The House, I think, is going to be tough for Democrats to hold. You're going against the historical trend that the party in power loses seats. You also had redistricting, which is going to cost them 5 to 7 seats, and they don't really have that to give up. So they would have to effectively expand their majority, which is extremely hard to do. But as I said, we don't know that what's going to happen over the next 8 weeks. I saw the prediction markets put them at 28% to keep the House, which is probably about right. If someone offered me that kind of those odds, I'd probably take it. So pretty unlikely to keep the House, but you never know what's going to happen over the next 8 or 9 weeks. So it's possible. But again, my default assumption is Democratic Senate, Republican House. What that means for the next Congress, very likely to be complete gridlock, very likely to have lots and lots of investigations. The question, are those investigations that do capture kind of the attention of the country, or are they things like the Benghazi hearings, which went on for years as kind of, I don't want to say a sideshow, but almost like the background noise of Washington. Like there was always a Benghazi hearing happening for a number of years, but it didn't dominate things like in the Trump first impeachment, where like that was kind of Washington stop for that. So what that means is if you do have this background noise of investigations and things going on, does that mean that the executive branch basically can just carry on as normal, not ignore them, but not devote a lot of attention to it, and basically carry on with foreign policy and executive actions? In that case, I think we're going to see a lot of executive actions around climate, but not a ton on other legislative priorities. But then again, I think Biden's got a lot of his legislative priorities already done. The one thing that I think might happen in the next Congress is a child tax credit policy, simply because Senator Mitt Romney is a big proponent of that. I think he could actually get a bipartisan coalition for it. And it was one of like the last things that got cut from Build Back Better when it turned into the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's like one of the few legislative items that I think could survive. Not saying it will, but could. Then when it comes to the president for 2024, I again completely agree with Campbell. I think the indictment or non-indictment is going to be a huge issue. I personally think we're getting to the point where there's too much evidence not to indict. There's pressure to indict or not to. Sorry, there's too much pressure. There's a lot of pressure that will force the Justice Department to indict. There's a lot of evidence out there. Again, we just saw that news story that he had secrets about a foreign nuclear program. That's not the sort of thing that, as former Attorney General Barr said, you should just have at a country club. And what that means is that I think it's going to be very hard for the Justice Department or the FBI to say, oh, we'll just kind of ignore this and sweep it under the rug. And I think it's especially true because there's always been, criminal investigations and legal questions about the former president since he's left office. The New York Attorney General is investigating the Trump Organization, for example. The January 6th Commission is looking into things, but those all kind of came down to a subjective assessment of what was his mindset, what was his intent, was on January 6th, was he speaking metaphorically or did he really mean go to the Capitol? This is very cut and dry. Like, did you have a document in your possession? Yes or no? Yes. Well, that was illegal. Did you have in this statement that you had turned it all in? Yes or no? Yes. you did, but you still had it. And that's why I think it's going to be very hard for them to do. Now, one thing that I do have a question for, and I'm not connected with a lot of Republican insiders, but for 5 years, we heard members of Congress say off on background to reporters how much they disliked former President Trump. They wouldn't go on record because they were afraid of losing re-election, but they were very happy to talk to journalists and say, oh, we don't like him, we didn't vote for him. I mean, even the 2016 election, he didn't receive a majority of the votes in many of the early primaries. There was a lot of coalescing around their eventual nominee, but there was not a lot of love lost. And we even remember the weekend of Access Hollywood, there was immediate distancing from the likes of Paul Ryan. I mean, Paul Ryan famously went through the first few years pretending he didn't see those tweets that the former president sent out. So my question, I don't know what it is. If he is indicted, does the base rally around him? Does he go on Truth Social and Newsmax and OANN saying you have to support me, but everyone else sees it as a chance to separate themselves from him? We didn't see this with the initial investigation, with the initial search warrant. We did see Marco Rubio, Ron DeSantis come out in support of him, but we didn't see Mitch McConnell do that. Mitch McConnell had a very anodyne statement saying, like, we need to see more of the facts. If he is indicted, and if we do have a lot more of these sorts of news stories that come out, do we see more people start to take the line of, well, we need to see what's going to happen, we need to see this, especially since if the former president isn't going to run, that means there's a chance for a different, very ambitious politician to become a presidential nominee. And maybe they think that's the sort of thing. So the thing I'm looking for is, if there's an indictment, what does Ron DeSantis do? He's seen as the most likely nominee other than Trump. Does he start to have these statements saying, we absolutely abhor it, it's terrible, it's awful, but we have to respect the process and we let the legal thing go? And basically, they're not going to push him off the boat, but they're not going to really take a lot of effort throwing the life raft in after him. So that's what I mean, I do have all the concerns that Campbell said about political violence and what random people around the country are going to do. But when it comes to political elites, I do wonder if they'll see this as a moment to basically let the Justice Department do what they've wanted someone to do for 4 or 5 years, as they watched former President Trump, have low approval ratings, lose the House, lose the Senate, lose the White House, and as they're looking for a way to turn the page to 2024. Again, that's not a prediction, that's just a speculation, because I think it's too far in the future and too uncertain for really anyone to have any clear ideas of what absolutely will happen or won't happen. These are just possible scenarios.
Yeah,
Wow, there's a lot there. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, guys, I hear what Oates says. I think that this is a time in the history of our country, the arc of the history of the country. I'm going to speak this as literally as nonpartisanly as I can say this, that the former president has, even his lowest, had 30% of the country with him, right? Hovers around 40-45% typically. If that holds, the Justice Department has to roll the dice and think that they're not going to get one of those 45% on a jury. If you indict and don't criminally prosecute the former president, I mean, we're in for a real challenge in our country, a real challenge. If you're the Justice Department and do you really think you're not going to get one of those 45% on a jury? If you go as the United States of America and try a former president of the United States and do not convict, we're in real trouble as a country, real trouble. And so just look, I know the Attorney General. I used to run the Judiciary Committee for a long time. Really cool heads after prevailed here. I know the Democrats hate the former president and the media hates them. I understand it. I get it. The Republican Party hated Bill Clinton. We indicted, the Republican Party, impeached him. I get all that. So, and I know we're in a deeply divided political time in our country. The only thing I suggest, and I've told my friends in DC this a lot, both Democrat and Republicans, we can easily lose a democracy. It's very easy to do it. There's never been a democracy that has succeeded, ever, not one. And we're at a tipping point in our country where I know that the Republicans and Democrats hate each other so much. but we have to take a very long view on this, very long view. Democracy is a very fragile thing, and so like I say this as a person who very likely will not support the former president if he seeks re-election. In fact, I'll tell you that I will not support him if he does seek re-election. But the arc of our country and the history of democracy throughout the world, throughout the history of our world, would suggest that we're likely at a tipping point where we may lose it. So I just urge my Democratic friends to take a very long view on how they do this and how they look at this. And I obviously urge the Justice Department, my senior friends in DC, to do the same. If we're going to go down the path of prosecuting former presidents and we don't put them in jail, good luck. Good luck for our country. I am personally scared of the future of our country if we're not able to do that. And the way our country is divided now, I don't think there's a jury in the planet. I don't think even in New York City or in San Francisco, where the bluest of the bluest, or Chicago, I don't think you could put 12 people together who would agree on that. So it would be very careful how we do this. And I certainly know that the Attorney General is a very thoughtful person. He's always has been. We just have to step back, take a very long view of how we do this, recognizing that we have the best country on the planet. It's been the savior of someone for almost 300 years, more than 300 years of saving the entire world. And we just cannot do silly things, in my opinion. They're going to risk that the future of saving nations, saving impoverished people throughout the history of the world because we're at each other's throats. And so I just, again, no one should be above the law, and certainly hope that the former president doesn't run. But we have to just be very careful how we proceed down this path.
Interesting, very somber thoughts there. I was going to comment on the fact that you're expecting another impeachment hearings, and it just seems like every president now, they're impeached. It's just becoming very normal now to do that. When back in the day with Clinton, it was considered shocking. So
yeah,
I think that's
once you ring the bell, of course, once the Republicans rang the bell with Clinton, it was a foregone conclusion the Democrats are going to do it, the next Republican president, right? So again, it just goes to what I said before, which is once you ring a bell in Washington, that bell just gets louder and louder and louder, and there's a snowball effect. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So 100% you can guarantee if we were a Republican president that you would see an indictment of the current president if they do choose to indict President Trump. It just is the way it is. I regret it. I hate it. I hate it about Washington, but it just is what it is. Both parties are guilty, I think that this is again, it goes to what I suggested before, which is democracies are very hard and very fragile to keep because of the tit for tat. And so I just hope, a little skeptical, but I hope that both parties can step back a little bit from the edge and suggest that we just be very, very careful how we proceed, recognizing that politics shift and it will shift. And when it shifts, the other side's in control, and the other side will do what this side is doing today.
Very interesting. We are coming up sort of the last bit of this, and I'm not seeing many questions, so please post questions if people have them. One thing that I'm thinking about is, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of startups, a lot of companies, as well as nonprofits, and they're trying to figure out what's happening and then what do they need to do about it. So do you have any sort of tips for, like, if it does shift to Republicans take control of the House, what does that mean? Like, as far as policies, how would that impact businesses and the economy? Do you all have any thoughts on that? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that it probably won't have a huge impact on an entrepreneur trying to work with the federal government, because gridlock just means that what we currently have will just continue through the logic of inertia. So whatever your plan is now for dealing with the bureaucracy is likely to stay the same. I mean, maybe some things will change, or maybe the biggest change is that change won't happen. So if you're expecting or hoping for a particular piece of legislation to come in, that might not happen. One thing that I think might be of interest is just how diverging the states are. And I think a good example of this is some states are having policies for much greater ESG considerations in their investments, and other states are banning consideration of ESG in their that being their investments. But it does matter especially if the federal government is gridlocked, to be aware of what's going on in your own state that you're operating in, or if you're considering expanding operations, what state you want to be in, because what are the states that you think are going to go in a direction that will be helpful to your business. So if you're an entrepreneur, but you need a lot of really smart and talented young people, is there a state that's making sure housing costs are low, because young people right out of college are the ones who have to spend the most amount of their income on housing, often, or at the very least, it's most sensitive to them. If you care a lot about, manufacturing, who is talking about manufacturing tax credits or infrastructure, or where there's energy costs, that sort of thing. Just one example of how states can operate at a level below where people pay attention is that energy in New England can be very volatile and expensive, because we only have one pipeline connecting New England to the rest of the grid. But we've been trying to electrify, and one source of electric power is hydropower from Quebec. And that is dependent on actually getting those little photons or electrons from Quebec into the Boston area where they're needed. That meant they had to go through either Vermont, but Vermont rejected a line, New Hampshire rejected a line, Maine approved a line, and then they had a referendum in 2020 or 2021 that killed the line. That was just ruled unconstitutional. So it looks like they might start building it. So again, if you're thinking over the next 20 years, where am I going to have secure energy, supply, and you're considering New England, well, what happened with the main Supreme Judicial Court actually matters for you. So I definitely recommend, if you're an entrepreneur, get in the weeds on the state and local level of where you're considering expanding, or, definitely hire someone who is in that area and can advise, because if you think the federal government is going on cruise control for a while, the states are where the action is going to be.
Yeah, that's good insight.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Oates on this, and I would compound it more. I think there's, when you see a lack of any direction or any forward movement on statutory language or changes in Congress, because there's likely going to be divided government, that action moves to the regulators in the federal level. So I think you're going to start seeing some regulatory changes happening from this administration through their different departments. So there will be, I think, some shifting of grounds, likely in a direction of more regulation, not less regulation, over the course of the next 2 years, throughout the panoply of the departments of the federal government. One further thing I totally agree on with Chris Oates is that given the current makeup of the federal judiciary and certainly the Supreme Court, we're likely starting to see with a few decisions, most notably the reversal of Roe v. Wade, a significant shift back to state legislatures and the governors. And so I think there's going to be a lot of power. Washington's going to start divesting its power, which is a significant change over the course of the last 60 years, back to the states, empowering individual citizens and their state legislatures to have this kind of patchwork of America where 50 states can compete amongst themselves for individuals and for businesses. And so I think it's likely what we're going to start seeing happening now because of the makeup of DC and certainly the makeup of the federal judiciary.
And I just want to throw one curveball in at the end for everyone considering stuff. If Democrats hold the House and expand the Senate to 52 or more, I think that one thing that we might see is statehood for DC and a statehood referendum for Puerto Rico. That's something that's been bubbling up in Democratic circles. There's been votes on it in Congress, but Joe Manchin very early on in this past Congress said he wouldn't be in favor of it. If that does happen, then you have a question of, well, I mean, first of all, that was likely going to help Democrats in the Senate, but also, does that mean that DC is going to be a better place to do business because it will now have congressional representation, as well as Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has been back and forth in terms of its regulatory environment over the last 40 years, in terms of tax changes. Its electricity system went into receivership. I believe that's the right term. And so if you're considering it, building operations in Puerto Rico, the regulatory environment that you're working in might change dramatically over the next few years if they do become a state. So that's just something to keep in mind, because it could be especially if you're trying to expand operations in the Caribbean. I know Campbell's in Florida, and Miami is kind of the US capital for Latin American headquarters, but it may be the case that Puerto Rico starts to become that as well if they do get statehood, or if they don't get statehood, but the regulations change anyway. It's something to keep in mind. People don't often talk about it, but it is, they are American citizens. So I think that is the sort of situation that can't go on forever. So at some point, there's going to be a change.
Yep. So I see a question here. How do you sense the rest of the world perceives the United States right now?
Yeah, hesitantly. I think there's, especially in Europe, for example, you see these stories that a Trump second term would have meant pulling out of NATO or withdrawing troops from South Korea. And I think there's a concern that if Trump wins in 2024, that's going to happen. So there's a lot of, especially in Europe and among many of our allies, kind of a relief that Trump didn't win. I mean, they don't say that, I think, openly, but they're not that secret about it, but a concern that this might not last. So where is the United States here to stay? Does it mean that the United States can't ever be trusted for more than 4 years at a time? Which I think that is, from a foreign policy perspective, that is one of the most dangerous developments of the last few decades, is that many areas there is no bipartisan consensus anymore. So our allies don't even believe we can sign a treaty, or if we do sign a treaty, it's just going to be torn up. I think one of the most interesting parts of this was that the Iran nuclear deal, the way it was framed, it only required 40 votes in the Senate rather than a traditional 67 for a treaty. So that's something that I think is they're concerned about, because they don't know how much they should give up in any negotiation with the US if we're just going to take concessions and then 4 years later turn around and rip the whole deal up.
Yeah, look, I'm this and many other things. There's obviously two sides of the coin. I love my partner Chris Oates, who's decidedly a Democrat. But look, I think that I think that there's, like it or not, I think obviously I certainly, as I said before, I hope he doesn't run again. But I think many people would suggest that Russia would never have invaded Ukraine had President Trump been president. Certainly, we would not have withdrawn from Afghanistan the way we did. Under the Trump administration, we successfully got all of NATO to start upping their how much they spent on NATO to 2% of each of their budgets, which I think was significantly helpful going into the Ukraine-Russia challenge, because NATO actually had the wherewithal to be able to put people and supplies in place. But it's an interesting and very difficult challenge. The China-Russia issue the China and Taiwan issue is a significant issue that requires a lot of strength. Iran is obviously still seeking nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities, and obviously Russia and Ukraine and many other challenges around the world. And so, the president's inbox externally outside of our country is very full. I certainly hope and pray that he's guided well to make sure that we have we remain safe. But there's just challenges everywhere, and so I think that look at the bottom line is that there's certainly, both domestically and internationally, there are two schools of thought. There's one typically, I'm an educator, I'm a professor, so but there's one, typically the Democrats like to do a consensus building exercise externally. Republicans tend to be more of an more America first focus. We see the difference in the two regimes. Again, like it or not, the Trump administration, those 4 years are probably some of the safest years around the world. Biden administration, I will let history be the judge of how that's worked. But I think, again, that the reality is that we are where we're at. And so again, we have one president at a time, and certainly hoping that he maintains a very strong and dominant posture around the world, and so that we can maintain and remain safe for as long as he's president.
All right. Well, any other final thoughts for our audience today before we wrap up?
Go out and vote, knock
Go
on
out and
doors,
vote.
get involved. It's yeah, I mean, it's very, very rewarding to actually get involved in a political campaign, even if it's just for, you know, mayor of your small town. So definitely go out and do it this fall.
Yeah, I agree with that one. Chris Campbell, any other thoughts?
No, I just, yeah, again, as the bipartisan guy, I just hope that sometime, we're in the heat of election. I know that's it's going to fall in deaf ears certainly between now and November, but I certainly hope we can find some way post-November that we can come together and start finding things we can agree on. Divided government sometimes can actually lead to some deals legislatively. Really, my fingers are crossed so we can actually hope to find some path forward on those issues. We have a lot of challenges ahead. We have the most amazing country on the planet, and the most amazing country in the history of the world, effectively. And so we just need to make sure to continue fighting for that, and hopefully that we all continue to remain Americans first, and recognize that we all have the same goals, same desires, and that's certainly my hope. And it's certainly the thing I always tell my friends in senior capacities in DC, and I would extend it to the audience as well. But please go out and vote. Your vote really does matter. This is going to be in fact, some districts are going to be quite close. So certainly, best way to express your voice and our representative democracy is by voting, and so please do so.
On that note, get out and vote. We will see you guys on our next series. And thanks so much for dialing in. Bye.